Hydrogen has been championed as essential to decarbonisation, yet comprehensive policy support has not been forthcoming. Recently, hydrogen's role in essential industrial processes has become apparent, since global supply chains have been put in jeopardy. In a world defined by geopolitical instability, where does hydrogen fit into the energy mix? Will demand be driven by decarbonisation or security? With over 1,500 planned pilot hydrogen projects worldwide, DNV's new forecast examines the prospects of the hydrogen industry.
Hello and welcome to the launch of DNV's special Hydrogen Report to 2060, which is part of the Energy Transition Outlook series. Over the next hour, we will present to you our key findings and we will hear from experts representing some of the most important companies in the hydrogen industry. Before that, I have one key practical piece of advice. If you're watching live on LinkedIn, you are welcome to ask some questions in the chat, and DNV's experts are on hand to answer. But now I have the pleasure of introducing the CEO of Energy Systems at DNV, Ditlev Engel.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. We are launching this report at a pivotal time for the hydrogen industry. There are now over 1,500 planned pilot and small-scale hydrogen projects worldwide. About one-third have advanced to final investment decision, but only a few have advanced to construction. This is a global industry, but it is China which has been the biggest investor in hydrogen, and their latest 5-year plan indicates its continuing strategic importance to Beijing. The industry is poised for growth, but there are key challenges which must be overcome. To grow, we must work together to close the safety confidence gap. Operational learning from small to medium pilots can certainly help hydrogen to scale. However, it is not a copy and paste exercise to move from pilot to scale. We still need further best practices and increased standardization to unlock investment capital. There also needs to be much greater policy clarity. At its current maturity, hydrogen remains reliant on policy, public support, and credible carbon price. We published our first comprehensive hydrogen report in 2022 when the hydrogen hype cycle was at its peak. However, the buzz around hydrogen was not matched by policy, and since then, the energy trilemma has pulled strongly towards energy security. Decarbonization actions have weakened, most obviously in the US, but also elsewhere. At the expensive end of decarbonization, clean hydrogen has suffered disproportionately with cutbacks and delays to policy support. As a result, we have scaled back our long-term forecast for hydrogen to 2050 by 35%. But I want to be very clear. That still leaves a substantial market for hydrogen. Overall, hydrogen volumes will grow by 170% and will see cumulative investments of $3.2 trillion to 2060. Scaling hydrogen is reliant to many factors, but it certainly requires collaboration. For example, closing the safety confidence gap can only be achieved if we work closely together. So I encourage you to reach out to me or any of my DNV colleagues so we can safely scale the hydrogen industry together. Before we hear from some of the companies working in this field, I give the floor to my colleague, Magnus Killingland, who will run you through the main findings of the report.
Thank you, Ditlev. The next phase of scaling the clean hydrogen industry will not be driven by ambition alone, but certainly by collaboration and implementation of regulations. From early pilots, industry and governments have learned a lot the past few years. The clean hydrogen and derivative sector is poised for further growth. Today, the global hydrogen industry is already a massive engine of the economy, producing 100 million tons annually. This is used in fertilizer for our foods, refining fuels, and processing chemicals and plastic we see all around us. However, since hydrogen relies on fossil fuels, it also releases 1,300 million tons of CO2 emissions into our atmosphere every year. This equals to about 3.4% of current world energy-related CO2 emissions. Today, only about 1% of the hydrogen production is considered clean, with low emissions. That is either from renewable power with electrolysis or carbon capture from fossil sources. This means we have to accelerate from 1 to 100 very fast if we are to reach climate targets for this sector and decarbonize specific hard-to-electrify sectors. I have 4 key messages for you today, which we will dive into in a moment. Firstly, despite difficult formative years for clean hydrogen, we do see growth ahead. Secondly, energy security may play a role for some regions and for some types of hydrogen technologies. Thirdly, implementing regulations and policies are crucial. Finally, there are some gaps which need verification, specifically for safety and emissions when scaling from first pilots. Our forecast sees clean hydrogen playing 2 main roles in the transition. Firstly, it is to clean up the fossil grey hydrogen we already depend on, for instance for fertilizer and in refineries for fuel production. That is shown as grey fossil unabated hydrogen. Secondly, it's to use clean hydrogen for decarbonize some very specific hard-to-electrify sectors, such as steel production, as a building block for fuels for aviation and maritime, and decarbonize parts of the chemical industry. Hydrogen will likely grow overall by 170% from today to 2060, while clean hydrogen will grow 100-fold from today and mitigate more than 2,000 million tons of emissions annually by 2060. That is 5% of global energy-related emissions today and more than 10% in 2060 when emissions overall decline. This development is fundamentally driven by policies and the implementation of regulations, which must be further enforced and continued for several decades. Our projections are not based on the role DNV hope hydrogen will play, including derivatives, but the role DNV expect hydrogen and derivatives will play in the energy transition. At DNV, we have reduced our mid-century forecast for hydrogen and derivatives by 35% compared to our 2022 edition. Not because the ambition is lower, but because reality is clearer. Clean hydrogen remains entirely reliant on policy, financial support, and a credible carbon price. There has simply been a lack of implementation of needed regulations and legislation so far. However, one of our findings is that a new factor may matter more going forward. Energy security will boost hydrogen production in energy importing countries. The question is how and where, and if it will compromise decarbonization efforts. There will be regional variations, and this depends on the resources available for renewable power build-out, power grids and pipelines, CCS capacities, and other supporting infrastructure. At the same time, existing fossil facilities may be reduced. The highest net growth will be in China, and in total we foresee a growth of about 10 million tons per year of clean hydrogen for the next decade by 2035. It is worth to mention that clean hydrogen is not just about decarbonization. It's about security of supply of a range of products, even for our crops, grains, livestock, and food on the table. For energy importing nations, renewable hydrogen will increasingly ensure the security of supply. The renewable hydrogen and derivatives can either be produced locally by renewable power, when that's available, or imported from new regions with low-cost power and hydrogen production. And for the fertilizer producers globally, these hold the keys to global food security using hydrogen as a feedstock, and today mainly from natural gas and some coal. Our forecast recognizes that as new, clean, diversified supply chains are scaled up, even coal-based hydrogen remains a necessary medium-term bridge to ensure the world continues to be fed. Both renewable and the dirtiest high-emitting hydrogen will secure our food on the table, and may increasingly so when supply chains are disrupted or natural gas has a high cost or simply is not available. Scaling new technology safely, especially complex gas systems such as hydrogen and conversion to derivatives, is difficult. And scaling clean hydrogen is not about one breakthrough. Several processes and complex dependencies must happen in parallel. The world has scaled other energy technologies fast before, like solar and wind power, LNG, batteries and electric vehicles. However, clean hydrogen might not scale as fast. That's why strengthening and implementing regulations, policies, and lasting over time is so crucial for further scaling. One challenge with these new technologies are costs. They will not be competitive on their own. It will have to follow similar cost reductions as solar and wind power and electric wheels the past 2 to 3 decades. And this graph shows the cost gap, and that it takes time to close depending on region. And some regions are dependent on mandates and subsidies until the gap is closed, even with a higher carbon price. You need mandates in addition, and subsidies. Zero on the y-axis represents cost parity with grey hydrogen cost. So anything above that line means the clean hydrogen is more expensive. Anything below that line means the clean hydrogen is cheaper compared to grey hydrogen. We see that clean hydrogen is closing the cost gap for some regions over time. But as mentioned, only when you have sufficient carbon prices. On the positive side, there are a number of small to medium pilot projects ongoing, demonstrating that the technologies performs well. However, moving from small pilots to gigawatt-scale hubs is not a simply copy and paste exercise. It requires a profound understanding of new aggregated risks and the needed barrier management to protect the workers and the third parties. DNV has facilitated several joint industry projects with large-scale testing. These continue into the next phases with recommended practices and updated standards. DNV see that evidence and results from new and scaled-up production technologies are documented, and more trust is built through de-risking. Regulatory iteration is also ongoing in leading regions and nations to support the development of scaling further. The learnings from the first kind of large-scale projects and plans and these joint industry projects are key going forward. The new clean hydrogen industry is well positioned for further scaling. We navigate uncertain waters, but clean hydrogen has a mission. The reason is all about emission reductions, but also increasingly energy and food security. To summarize, going forward, it's about 3 main topics for scaling further and unlock financial backing. It's about fine-tuning the regulations and implementing these in legislation. Secondly, it's about verifying large-scale operational safety concepts. And thirdly, establish trust in documenting emission reductions. That is how renewable and low-carbon hydrogen can make a difference for hard-to-electrify sectors. And you can read all about it in our Hydrogen Outlook for you to download for free. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. Energy security and resilience is now the defining feature of the energy transition. So how does this impact the role of hydrogen? To answer that question, I've been joined by a panel of experts. Online, I've been joined by Philip Christiani, who is Partner for Energy Transition Funds at Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. We're also joined by Fiona Simon, CEO for the Australian Hydrogen Council, And here in the studio, I'm joined by Martin van Toff, Global Commercial Manager for LC Hydrogen and Derivatives at Technip Energies. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Adrian Zambon, who is actually the lead author of our new report and member and principal researcher of our energy transition research team. Welcome. So, the key topic of this panel is hydrogen future in a world shaped by energy security. Philip, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners is a global leader in energy infrastructure investments, specializing in developing and constructing some of the most impressive renewable projects. And you also recently published a report on a roadmap for an electrified, competitive and resilient European energy system. My first question to you is, given the renewed focus on energy security, do you experience that the investment case for hydrogen has become more difficult?
I think that first and foremost, it's important that in this discussion that we lift the eyes from the hydrogen discussion and discuss this in the context of the wider energy transition. And when we look at this for Europe, the wider energy transition is an electrification transition. And as you rightly alluded to, we just published a report on the wider energy transition or the energy transition at large. And our conclusion is that this is certainly possible to do in Europe. It is possible to have an electrified Europe with the build out of capacity. And if you build out capacity, there will be so much low price energy in the system that we will be able to drive a transition of hydrogen as well. So with this slightly complicated answer, my reply to your question would be, I think this is fostering a renewed growth and a renewed interest in the hydrogen discussion. And at the same time, I have to say, we are seeing this slightly delayed development of legislation that's also starting to take hold in Europe.
So you're an optimist. Let's see, Martin, moving to you. Technip Energies designs also the most complex energy projects on the engineering and construction side. Do you see blue hydrogen playing a longer-term role than the policymakers envisage?
Well, Technip Energies is there already for more than 60 years in hydrogen, and one of the first hydrogen projects was already blue. So at that time, in the 1960s, we already built a hydrogen plant with CO2 capture. At that time, the CO2 was vented to atmosphere because of quality reasons to make the hydrogen. So that means that there's a lot of infrastructure in the market already with CO2 capture from the older days. And from there, you can already utilize that to make blue hydrogen. So that's one of the things which continues for the longer term. Next to that is there's a huge market also in the traditional refinery business, which needs to decarbonize. So fuel decarbonization, especially also fuels used on the industrial complexes, is needed. And with the off gases and all kind of fuel gases in the network, then blue hydrogen will play there a significant role, in combination, of course, with the renewable or clean hydrogen which is coming. So yes, there will be a much longer
than what the policymakers are envisaging. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Over to you, Fiona. You are the CEO of the Australian Hydrogen Council. Could you maybe give us the perspective from Southeast Asia? How does hydrogen fit into the energy mix in the region, given the pivot towards energy security?
Thank you. I think we'd already seen earlier versions of the pivot toward energy security, particularly after the war in Ukraine commenced, where we were starting to see hydrogen being discussed much more seriously in terms of sovereign capability and supply diversification. And so for countries with strong renewable resources, including Australia, part of the appeal was always that hydrogen potentially allowed domestic production of fuels and industrial inputs that would otherwise be imported. And then for countries like Japan and Korea, it created the possibility of diversifying supply chains and expanding existing trading relationships. I think what we've seen change now, though, is a conversation that's become a bit more grounded and much more specific. So from an Australian perspective, there's definitely been a shift away from the very broad sort of export narrative that we used to have toward a stronger focus on domestic capability and industrial resilience. And very, very importantly for us, it's not just a matter of energy security. It's also increasingly about food security, fertiliser security. And because for us, at least in Australia, fertiliser imports are a major source of vulnerability. So what we're seeing now is a clearer focus on the areas where hydrogen or hydrogen-derived products genuinely solve a difficult problem, like fertiliser, green iron, potentially alumina, shipping fuels like ammonia and methanol, and some other industrial feedstocks. And so, where the molecules matter and electrification either wasn't an option or it's too hard. We're also seeing in Australia a focus on low carbon liquid fuels and biofuels, which also actually reinforce the hydrogen conversation rather than replacing it, because we still need hydrogen to process and upgrade these fuels. So the overall effect of the current energy security environment hasn't really been to broaden the hydrogen story, but it's reinforcing the hydrogen conversations, because we can see how important it is strategically, and it's difficult to replace from an industrial perspective. But the other thing is, though, I think the key lesson we've learned from the last few years is that ambition really isn't enough, not ambition alone. So we really need to see coordinated markets, stronger policy support, planning and demand-side mechanisms, because we're seeing so far, even with previous shocks, that it's very difficult to proceed at scale without much greater support.
Thank you for your perspectives. That's interesting, and also interesting that you mentioned the fertilizer industry. We actually have a representative from Yara in our second panel, so we'll continue that discussion there. Adrian, can you broaden the discussion for us and say something about China? Because China is the biggest investor in hydrogen. The report actually says that 60% of electrolyzers are already produced in China. So why is it viewed as such a strategic asset there, and will it export its solutions in a similar way like for the solar industry?
Yeah, good point. I mean, yeah, China is very much the elephant in the room when it comes to hydrogen. So basically, today is the largest producer and user of hydrogen. Most of it is coal-based. But if you look at the latest 5-year plan that they've released this year, there's a big push now for renewable hydrogen and especially for securing their industrial base for chemicals, for refining. And so they really have, and on top of that, as you mentioned, they already have the means to achieve these ambitions, because if you look at global capacity, so you mentioned 60-70% of global capacity is installed of manufacturing capacity is installed in China. And out of the 20 gigawatts they have there, only 2 gigawatts are currently in use. So it means there's only 10%. So there's a huge overcapacity for electrolyzer that can support the growth, at least for the coming years, and meet these ambitions. And we think they will meet these ambitions. But that being said, when it comes to exports, hydrogen is not a plug-and-play solution. It's not like solar PV or batteries. So it's more like a system. So if you take into account all the balance of plant and storage and all the things that go around, if you install here, for example, in Europe, hydrogen production, electrolyzer would be only 10% of the cost project cost. So in our analysis, there is some outside of China. There is a lot of space for non-Chinese electrolyzer manufacturer to take their space. So
slightly different situation than for the solar industry.
Exactly.
Interesting, yeah. Philip, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners proposed hydrogen production on the so-called energy islands. Can you tell us something about those energy islands? And is there still an appetite for such large-scale projects given the focus on energy security?
I will do that. First, just a comment to the discussion about electrolyzers. As mentioned before, I think it's important to think of hydrogen as the derivative of electricity production, not the other way around. And as a consequence, hydrogen will be produced in an intermittent fashion. And if you want to produce hydrogen in an intermittent fashion, the alpha and omega of the case becomes CapEx. And I fully recognize what you just mentioned about the so-called balance of plant. What we're just seeing is that some of these OEMs, they are now proposing containerized balance of plant solutions. So I would assume that at some stage we will see fully containerized solutions coming out of China, including balance of plant, and that will help drive down the capex significantly. To your question on the energy islands, and for those who don't know what an energy island is, the energy island is the idea to build a fixed structure in the middle of the North Sea to consolidate energy production. Again, the North Sea is a 500,000 square kilometer, not an ocean, but a large sea, and it's pretty unique in the world that we have a large ocean where the wind is literally always blowing, and there's no water depth over 50 meters. This is very special. It's unique for Northern Europe, and it has the potential to become a source of energy for decades to come from here. And we believe that there will be a very, very significant outbuild of offshore wind in the North Sea. Right now, the typical wind farm is being built in a distance of 20 to 40 kilometers from the coast. But the second this distance increases to, let's say, 80 or 100 kilometers, we just see that there's financial and economic rationale behind building sort of so-called hubs and spoke models where the energy is consolidated on larger facilities. They can be an island or metal structure or something else, and the transmission to the land happens via a consolidated grid. And then to your question, can these islands ever become the source of hydrogen production? And number one, we think there's an economic argument for this consolidation of the power production in the North Sea. And secondly, it is very likely that again intermittent energy will be able to produce hydrogen using intermittent energy on these islands at competitive rates. And we brought these discussions forward politically in a number of places in Europe. And we understand that these islands it will take time to build, and right now we can build wind farms much closer to the ocean or to land, but it will be an important political discussion to take now to make sure that this moves in sync with the rest of the build out.
Very interesting. Thank you. Martin, we know hydrogen is expensive and requires policy support. What is the key to getting the costs down, and how important is standardization in the process?
Well, as already mentioned by the previous speaker, is that standardization, if we look to the renewable and the green hydrogen, is very important. So the balance of plants, as mentioned, is something where a significant cost is. If we look to the green hydrogen, if we compare that to the blue hydrogen, I think it's important to go on scale. Mm-hmm. So if we want to utilize the blue hydrogen, you have to build it on scale, which is always having challenges also with certain investments needs to be placed, but also centralize it in industrial areas and utilize it as a hub to decarbonize the whole industrial area there and making blue hydrogen affordable there. So then you're also not depending on the natural gas comes in, but also on the available sources at the area there.
Yeah. Very good. Back to Australia, maybe, Fiona. Australia has positioned itself as a hydrogen exporter, and you mentioned that already a little bit, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. Does the global focus on the energy security strengthen that ambition? So, tell us something more about this export opportunity and plans.
Thank you. I think it does change things a little bit. Because even before the current energy security environment, we were already seeing Australia's hydrogen export story change. So earlier on, there was a very strong focus on large-scale exports of hydrogen as a future energy commodity. And over time, we've seen the conversation then shift to be more around derivatives and industrial products that are easier to transport, easier to integrate into existing systems, and more clearly tied to sources of demand like ammonia, methanol, and green iron. At the same time, we were also seeing a much stronger focus on domestic use cases. So the early idea that you could just go straight to export without using it domestically has been fundamentally turned on its head. So even as we're talking to nearby trading partners, they're saying, well, actually, you need to do it domestically, get the prices down before we'll commit to it for export. So we're seeing this shift in how we were already talking about it. But the current focus on energy security does reinforce what we need to do because, again, we're now talking about fuel security in Australia, fertiliser security, industrial resilience and low carbon manufacturing. challenge that we have in Australia is that we've already lost a lot of manufacturing capability. We're quite low on the economic complexity scale. So it's not like there was a market we could just sort of switch on domestically. It's challenging. You're down to a handful of facilities and major decisions that people need to make about those facilities. But I'm hoping that the energy security argument does strengthen the appeal of trusted suppliers like Australia over time, because I don't think we're going to ever outcompete. I think it's unlikely that we will outcompete on a pure commodity price some of the other countries. But so we might not become the lowest cost producer of bulk hydrogen commodities at a global scale, but rather than dominating commodity exports, that notion of building credible long-term industrial partnerships and products and supply chains, I think that the current energy security challenge, and if I look at it through the vested interest of how Australia needs to do it, I think it's given us a greater incentive to do what we need to do domestically in order to do better in an export market. Thank you.
Adrian, is there anything from the report on exports that you can add to the discussion?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of what we, in our analysis, a lot of what we see is the same that Fiona just described for Australia. It's happening in all energy importing countries and regions. They realize that, yes, they are reliant on a few key players for the supply of key materials like fertilizer or even though kerosene in Europe now. But that being said, there will be some regions where the cost of hydrogen, the production cost of hydrogen, or the capacity to produce hydrogen will be limited. Like it was mentioned, Japan, South Korea, maybe Europe also. And so there would make sense to import from other countries with lower production costs. With some, of course, limitations, it was mentioned again. So only probably as derivatives, because they are way easier to transport. There is an existing infrastructure to transport ammonia, methanol, or synthetic fuels. So that limits a bit the scope of what hydrogen imports can cover. And that being said, so we saw a shift, like from our last report 4 years ago, and then today there was these big projects of big importing countries like Chile or trying to mimic a bit what is done for LNG production, but we see now, at least for the next 10, 15, 20 years, that's more a point-to-point trade that will happen. There's no commoditized market in our forecast, and that link between the supply and the demand is really important for exporting regions and exporting projects to consider.
Thank you. Philip, back to you. I've got a question on the policy side, because the policy actually never matched the hype around hydrogen. Do you expect renewed policy focus now on scaling hydrogen and linking it to energy security, maybe, especially in Europe?
If we talk about Europe, I think I would argue that the policy actually matched the hype from the beginning. Or at least the ambition of the policy matched the hype from the beginning. I mean, for the last 5 years, we've known in detail the construct and design of the ETS. We've known and understood the construct and design of the CBAM. We've understood Refuel EU for ESAF, and we understood the Refuel EU maritime as well for the maritime sector. If I should say something, I think the implementation of the very ambitious regulation has been a little bit has been lagging, and it is still lagging in all honesty. And there's I think there's no doubt that the original targets of 20 million tons of hydrogen in Europe by 2030. That cannot be achieved, and many of the ambitions in the original RED III transposition will not be met either. And maybe it's good, actually. Maybe it's good that if the regulators and reality can meet each other in the coming years and put regulation together that can actually be achieved. I think that would be applauded by industry, both on the production side and on the offtake side.
Yeah, you talked about the lagging of the implementation. The report actually says that 1,500 projects, are in planning, but only 30% have reached the FID so far. But it's still an impressive amount of investments that's going into the industry. Maybe a final word to Fiona. You're leading a trade body, so you're representing many companies. Do you think that the hydrogen industry needs to maybe pivot and sell itself more as, an essential part of energy security?
I'm struggling with this myself at the moment. I struggle with the idea that there is a single hydrogen industry in the way that people talked about it a few years ago. So what hydrogen as a term did very effectively was bring together a number of very different industries that were all exploring difficult decarbonisation pathways. And under the umbrella of hydrogen, they were able to have a shared conversation about molecules, infrastructure and transition pathways. But as the sector, as various sectors have been maturing, the differences between the use cases are becoming much clearer. The story for fertiliser is not the same as the story for shipping fuels, not the same as the story for green iron or long duration energy storage. So it's been harder to tell one single hydrogen story in the abstract. At the same time, I think I keep coming back to the view that there's still important commonalities between these sectors, particularly around infrastructure, investment risk, industrial capability, and the need for coordinated policy support. So, for today, for example, people are talking about fuel security and fertiliser security based on an announcement that was made today ahead of a budget next week. And for most people, those two things are not the same. But to me, they're very similar because the molecule, the hydrogen's at the heart of a fair amount of the conversation there. So I don't think the industry necessarily needs to pivot and sell itself differently so much as become more precise about where hydrogen genuinely matters and how it fits within wider industrial systems. And in some sectors, the language is energy security. In others, it's industrial decarbonisation, fuel resilience, fertiliser security, future manufacturing capability. And for me, these narratives are key because we are in a political environment, because our markets don't exist. We are now in the heavily policy-shaped world. And so I think that's where trade bodies like ours need to evolve ourselves, and less about promoting hydrogen in the abstract and more about helping coordinate the industries, the infrastructure and the policy settings that can then underpin the emerging value chains. As to what we call ourselves, that is my ongoing struggle.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and you've got definitely a very important role in coordinating the companies and industries. I'm afraid we've already come to the end of this first panel. Thank you to our wonderful panel here in the studio and online. We will now move on to how the hydrogen industry can scale.
Hydrogen has a scaling challenge. Transferring the learnings from the lab and pilot projects into large-scale, commercially viable ventures is complicated. A safety confidence gap needs to be addressed, partly through best practice and increased standardization. And there needs to be greater policy and regulatory clarity to provide investor confidence. And these challenges must be solved to a backdrop of geopolitical tensions. How can hydrogen scale safely?
As we heard in Dietlet's introduction, there are now over 1,500 planned pilot hydrogen projects worldwide. But how do we take the next step and scale the hydrogen industry, and how can we do it safely? I have another panel of experts with me to discuss the hydrogen industry scaling challenge. We have Corinna Berger, Program Director for New Molecules at National Gas UK. Welcome. We have Vibeke Rasmussen, SVP for Product Management and Certification at Yara Clean Ammonia. Welcome. And we have two of DNV's hydrogen and sustainable fuel experts joining us. Corinne Taylor is Regional Manager for Northern Europe, who normally works out of the Netherlands. And online, we've got joining Youssef Naim, who is Regional Segment Lead for CEMELA, the Southern Europe, Middle East, Africa and Latin America region. That's a long title. And who is based in Dubai. Welcome, Youssef. Our title for this second panel is From Pilots to Industrial Scale, Delivering Growth Safely. Youssef, I would like to start with you. Scaling safely currently has an extra dimension in the Middle East. Can you tell us what the Iran war has done to the hydrogen industry in your region?
Definitely. I was happy to be on the panel, and I think it's definitely a very interesting question, especially with what's been happening recently in the region, unfortunately. But I think from a hydrogen and derivatives perspective, the situation actually highlights something very important. which is the growing role of hydrogen in energy security. So for different regions such as Europe and Asia, hydrogen and derivatives are no longer only about decarbonization, but also about diversifying supply and reducing dependency on single sources of energy. So for the Middle East, actually this reinforces the opportunity, but also reinforces the need to re-optimize the projects in a different way. So basically making projects, developing projects that are more resilient. So, doing that by basically looking at different exporting routes and means and building stronger infrastructure. So we definitely see the opportunity. At the same time, we see the risk, at least on the short term. So we see a risk increase when it comes to shipping, to logistics, to insurance, especially for projects that are export-oriented, like ammonia. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, now is being seen not only as a choke point for oil and gas, but as a potential choke point for hydrogen and derivatives as well. But which might have some implications on the short term when it comes to an increase in cost and also some delays in, I would say, project decisions or project execution. However, it's good to know. I mean, it's good to mention that on the long term, I think the picture is still the same. And actually, the situation reinforces the need to move even faster. And currently, hydrogen is being, I would say, implemented as part of a broader discussion on energy security, rather than just an energy transition topic.
Very good. Thank you, Youssef. That sounds positive. Viveke, Yara International is one of the world's leading suppliers of crop nutrition and ammonia-based solutions. Can you maybe start by telling us a little bit about Yara and also Yara Clean Ammonia, and help us understand how much ammonia Yara uses and the energy that is required for it?
Thank you. Yes, Yara is a global fertilizer company. So today we are present in more than 60 countries and sell to more than 140 different markets worldwide. And fertilizer, and especially nitrogen-based fertilizers, are produced from hydrogen, ammonia, and then fertilizers. So we have integrated production, and we are therefore a large producer of both hydrogen and ammonia today. And it's from this basis of ammonia that we also see that we can be a provider for ammonia for new users of ammonia as a fuel, as a hydrogen carrier, and into the power market. Today, we are not the largest producer of ammonia, but we are by far the largest transporter of ammonia. We have 18 terminals and 14 vessels that actually transport ammonia between our plants and also to external customers. So we are about 8.5 million tons of ammonia, import to Europe about 3.5–4 million tons, a bit depending on, and it's a 1 to 5, so that's total 1.5–2 million tons of hydrogen.
And you're one of the most ambitious fertilizer companies, I would say. So clean ammonia can help reduce the world's dependency on fossil fuels. What steps is Yara taking to decarbonize its ammonia, since you're working for clean?
And of course, it's our ambition in clean ammonia is definitely, in addition to serving the new users of ammonia, it's to decarbonize our own value chain in fertilizers production. So we look at this, and we have invested in a demonstration plant in Norway at our site in Herøya, which is a 24-megawatt electrolyzer, which is then feeding the existing ammonia synthesis loop in Herøya. It's only feeding about 3–4% of the hydrogen going into that ammonia plant. So it's a demonstration scale plant. But that's been operational for 2 years now. We're also in our plants in the Netherlands, which is the largest ammonia production plant in our European production base. We are there decarbonizing through CCS. So we are storing, taking out the CO2 and liquefying it, and then transporting that to the Northern Lights and storing it in Norway.
Fantastic project. Yeah, congratulations on that. Corinna, National Gas UK is the owner and operator of Great Britain's national gas transmission system, responsible for transporting gas across the country and maintaining critical energy infrastructure. We talk about a safety confidence gap in the report. Can you quickly give us an insight on the safety challenges of transmitting hydrogen?
Yes, of course. I think we have to remember, though, hydrogen has been utilised in many industry processes for a long time, and it is being transported in other areas of the globe, maybe not at the scale and quite in the same way that we're looking at for the future, but we should take learning from the work that has already been done. Some of the challenges that we do have, though, in what we're trying to do at the scale, and obviously in repurposing and reusing natural gas network assets that we already have, is something that we have had to look at in a lot more detail. And we have a significant gap in the data of the assets we have. They were built a long time ago. Trying to find all of the information that's relevant to repurposing them is very difficult and challenging. But also the lab scale testing that we're doing is not necessarily then correlating to the application testing that we're doing. And we're seeing that maybe some of the lab scale is more conservative than what you'd see in real life. So I think there is still a bit of a gap to fill. And I've just moved out of the research and development area to take that forward into construction and start to build that confidence in the work that we have been doing over the last 6 years with DNV.
Yeah, so you think you will be able to repurpose most of the network? Or?
Yeah, so the evidence to date showcases that we can technically repurpose everything. The only considerations are cost associated to that, and also being able to let go of the natural gas pipelines, because we still have to use those.
It's a big decision then,
yes.
Yes. Very good. Corinne, in Europe, the EU has confirmed that it will look again at the rules of green hydrogen and derivatives, the RFNBO. That's an abbreviation I'll ask you about. Tell us about these requirements and their potential importance for hydrogen.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important question. So just briefly, RFNBO stands for Renewable Fuels of Non-Biological Origin, which basically in plain English means green hydrogen and derivatives. And the EU set some really tough rules a few years ago to really make sure that projects could prove that they were using genuinely renewable electricity, and also that emissions through the whole value chain were kept very low. The problem is they are very difficult for projects to comply with, and there are two in particular. So one is around time matching. So after 2030, you would have to run your electrolyser in the same hour as you're getting your renewable electricity, which means a lot of ramping up and down, which adds a lot of cost to the production. And the other one was additionality. You have to use new unsubsidised renewables after 2028. And that also would add cost when you could also be using, connecting to, say, older renewables at lower cost. And so you've seen a lot of lobbying from industry and also from member states saying this doesn't make sense. It's all adding too much to cost. So we need to kind of ease these rules and bring them more into line with other parts of the world that are seeing faster growth actually than Europe in hydrogen, say China, for example. Well, the EU had always planned to look at these in 2028, and now they've said we're going to look at them this year. And probably what they're going to do is ease this matching, keep it monthly matching for a bit longer, and also push back the additionality. And I think that's all to the good, actually. We don't require electric cars to only be charged when the wind is blowing. So I think we have set too tough a standard for hydrogen, and we need to help to get the industry going, and then as electricity grids get more greener, we can then make the hydrogen rules tougher. So I think this is quite an important and positive development.
Sounds like a good plan. Vibeke, from your certification lens, what's the biggest remaining barrier to scaling cross-border trade in renewable and low-carbon ammonia?
And I would build on what Corinne says. We are actually now certifying the Herøya plant after the RFNBO requirements, because it would also be used for a fuel the Yara Eide, the container ship that we will have on the seas from next year. And we also see, being in Norway, of course, we have the Norwegian grid, which is very high on renewables, so we don't have the matching requirement at the moment, so that makes it a bit easier. But we see that the rules are coming, and I think being through, we see that there are more and more plants also being pre-certified. So I think the issue is really not now maybe the certification. I think people are trusting that it's a way of ensuring that we have a way of proofing the renewable points of the molecules. But I think it's also the requirements. Who is requesting this RFNBO hydrogen or ammonia? So it's the demand for it and really growing the demand centres, which is maybe the biggest hurdle.
Yeah. Very good. Youssef, I want to go back to you, back to Dubai. We are now seeing a shift from pilot projects to those giga-scale hydrogen developments in the Middle East. Can you walk us through some of the most notable projects or give us some insights into those?
Yeah, definitely. So I think what we're seeing in the Middle East is not just a scale-up, but actually it's a real shift in how hydrogen projects are being designed and delivered. So I think projects like NEOM, for example, in Saudi Arabia, which is a gigawatt scale project to be operational beginning of next year, is actually a great example of this transition, which is demonstrating large-scale integrated hydrogen and ammonia and derivative projects with export markets in mind. And we're also seeing the next wave of projects in Saudi Arabia, like the Yanbu project, which is also double the capacity of NEOM and to be operational in 2030. So this is for Saudi Arabia. Oman is also very strategic in this regard. So Oman has, the model for Oman is slightly different, but equally important. So what Oman is currently working on is developing large hydrogen clusters in areas like Duqm. So with centralized planning and integrated infrastructure and shared infrastructure. So basically building an ecosystem rather than building standalone projects. So these projects are very important for the industry because for a long time, hydrogen has been seen as promising but unproven. And what the Middle East is currently doing is helping de-risk hydrogen projects, but not only by proving the technology, by proving also bankability and operability of these projects. So yeah, while globally, while many regions are still piloting hydrogen, so the Middle East is already building industrial scale ecosystems. And I think that's a key turning point for the sector.
Definitely. And there's probably also more willingness to invest.
Yeah, definitely.
Very good. Corina, last autumn, National Gas and Centrica completed what was described the first real-life hydrogen blend into the national transmission system. What were the learnings and what evidence do you still need before blending can scale beyond this?
I think the learning was that it was quite uneventful. Actually, it was much easier when we got to doing the trial than anybody thought it was going to be. It had taken us a couple of years to get everybody on board through the safety assessments and the desktop studies. But when we got there, actually, it was very much like running with natural gas.
It worked.
The processes worked. It went into the power station system and there was nothing, no difference in how it was running or its efficiency. So actually, uneventful was the outcome.
That's good.
Yes.
So it just proves again, technology is there, but policies are lagging behind, like in many areas.
And confidence, I think, it's people's confidence.
Yeah. Corinne, there are many aspects of scaling up. I'm keen to hear, we discussed a little bit previously about the scaling opportunity. You had like 3 really insightful messages on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of challenges, but just to pick out 3. So the first one is actually offtake, picking up on what you said. You know, have you got people that will pay extra for green or low carbon hydrogen than what they're paying at the moment? That's, I think, the number one challenge. Then I think the second one you've got is on policy and actually sort of policy consistency. So the EU, for example, had the Renewable Energy Directive with blending mandates. Now the industrial blending mandates have kind of gone, and there is a lot of lobbying to water down other mandates, say for sustainable aviation fuels. So that introduces some uncertainty, because if the mandate's rock solid, you have a kind of business case that you will have a green premium. If the regulations are a bit uncertain, then there's always that risk that comes into the project. And then I think a third one I'd highlight would just be technical. So if you go from, say, 5 megawatts to 100 megawatts, you're not just putting 25 megawatt units side by side. You have to rethink the balance of plant, all of the risks and the safety, including the safety distances. All of that you have to think at in a different way. And of course, for some of these project developers, this is kind of new at this scale, particularly on green hydrogen. So there's a lot of learning and skills that also come with that too. So like I said, it's not an exhaustive list, but 3 things that I would pick out.
Very good point. Youssef, back to you. Given that the Middle East wants to export also to Europe and to Asia, what technical and policy options are available to help the Middle Eastern hydrogen competitiveness? What's required to make it really competitive hydrogen in the area?
Yeah. Sure. So when we talk about competitiveness, so the key point is not just about production cost, but also about the delivered cost to Europe and Asia. So the Middle East actually has a natural advantage there, being strategically located between Europe and Asia, so which helps reduce transport distances compared to other regions. In addition, the region benefits from some of the most competitive renewable energy resources. And since electricity is one of the main components of the cost when it comes to green hydrogen production, this creates a strong advantage for lowering production costs. There are also different steps that projects in the Middle East are taking to reduce the cost as much as possible. And so the main thing would be all of the projects or most of the projects are basically focusing on shipping the end product, the derivative or the end product, rather than shipping the pure the hydrogen itself. So whether it's ammonia, whether it's methanol, sustainable aviation fuels, or even green steel. So basically, this reduces the complexity, I would say, and makes the project basically much better in terms of economics. Second, what we're seeing in different countries such as Oman and potentially in Jordan as well. Developing integrated export hubs rather than standalone projects. So when multiple projects share infrastructure such as renewables, desalination, storage, pipeline, port facilities, and so on, the overall cost could eventually come down significantly. And another point would be scale. So projects in the Middle East they have a large scale. And basically these projects allow for more optimization across the value chain, which help also bring costs down. And finally, a good point to mention as well is the government support. So we are seeing a lot of government support in several countries. For example, basically support in allocating lands and exemptions or reduction in grid fees or in taxes, facilitation in terms of permitting processes, but also supporting projects in identifying off-takers. So I think with competitive renewables, large-scale infrastructure, and strong government support, the Middle East is really targeting to become one of the major hubs for hydrogen production and eventually export.
Thank you, Youssef. Corinne?
Yeah, can I just add to what you said there, Youssef? Because I think it's important. What we see in the ETO forecast is a growth in the use of gaseous hydrogen. And of course, there you probably want to produce it locally and move it by pipeline, but also in derivatives like sustainable aviation fuels or ammonia or methanol. And there, as Youssef says, you really have some advantages to producing it in cheap locations and shipping it. And that could also be cheap locations within continents. So, for example, Spain, which is one of the cheapest places in Europe, or it could be the Middle East, or it could be parts of China, for example. So I think this whole ecosystem will see a mix of hydrogen being moved by pipelines, but also derivatives being moved around by ships.
Yeah, very good. We're almost coming to an end, but I was going to ask Corinne, and maybe also if anyone else wants to comment on, from your perspectives, what are the next big questions that need to be answered to help hydrogen scale? So what is still needed for that next push?
I think it's that shared infrastructure piece that we're talking about, bringing production, demand, transport, storage all together in clusters, which we're doing in the UK already, and I know that across Europe that's happening as well. Sharing that infrastructure and making the most of it as a group.
Any other comments on that?
And I agree to that. And building on what you said also, and from our experience, we see that there needs to be a demand, but also the structural cost of energy. I mean, ammonia, hydrogen, it's really dependent on the energy, whether it's produced with gas as the raw material and then carbon capture, it's also a cost, or it's renewable. So structurally, where you have the lowest energy cost in the world will drive where you can produce. And then you have to look at your existing assets, really, how do you decarbonize those? What's the best? And therefore, I also think we need to be a technology neutral on the different hydrogen pathways to really look into how we balance the derivatives and e-fuels.
Yeah.
I think that's really important because it's all about emissions at the end of the day. That's what really matters. And I think it's also about energy security too. So we're seeing now with the Iran war the vulnerabilities of fossil fuel supply chains, for example, for fossil kerosene, which is really at a choke point with the Strait of Hormuz closure. So I think having hydrogen and derivative fuels can also help some regions improve their energy security over time.
And that brings us back to the first panel, actually, where we discussed energy security. I think this is a very nice closing, and we're out of time. So thank you to all our panelists, to Youssef online, and our wonderful experts here in the room. As ever, you can download all our reports on the Energy Transition Outlook website. That includes country reports, deep dives into different technologies, and regional reports. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.